The air in the courtroom felt thick, heavy with unspoken grief and a harsh fluorescent glow. All eyes were fixed on the young man, Michael, standing before the judge. He was handsome in a way that often gets mistaken for charm, but today, it was just cold. His smirk was a flicker, quick and almost imperceptible, as he glanced towards the gallery. There, the victim's family sat, shoulders hunched, their faces etched with a pain that no court could truly mend. A mother clutched a worn photograph, her knuckles white. A father stared blankly ahead, his jaw tight. Michael's dismissive gesture, a slight shrug and a barely audible scoff, was like a physical blow to them, a fresh wound on top of old ones. It was a gesture that screamed, "I don't care." Then he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the hushed murmurs. "Honestly, it was just a bit of fun. Didn't think it'd be such a big deal." The words hung in the air, blunt and callous, a shocking display of a complete lack of remorse. You could feel the collective gasp from the audience, a ripple of outrage that threatened to break the court's decorum. But Judge Caprio, seated high on his bench, remained perfectly still. His gaze was locked on Michael, unblinking, unreadable. There was no anger visible, no immediate flash of judgment. Just a profound, almost unnerving calm that surprised everyone. It was the kind of composure that suggested a mind working many steps ahead, a quiet storm gathering beneath a placid surface. A bailiff, a burly man with a kind face, shifted his weight, taking a half step forward. It was a subtle movement, a signal that something was coming, that the wheels of justice were indeed turning, even if slowly. But what form that justice would take, what the judge's unexpected calm truly signified, remained a mystery. The full weight of his impending decision was still veiled, a secret held tightly within the judge's steady gaze. The tension in the room was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Some laughter echoes only in empty chambers. Michael's careless laughter, his flippant disregard, felt like that, hollow, destined to resonate only in the barren spaces of his own empathy. The judge leaned forward then, just slightly, a subtle but distinct shift in his posture. It wasn't an aggressive move, but it carried an immense weight, a quiet authority that silenced the last whispers in the room. His eyes, though still calm, now held a deeper intensity, a glint that suggested a mind fully engaged, preparing for a decisive move. Michael's fate, whatever it might be, hung in that precise moment, suspended between his arrogant indifference and the judge's unwavering will. The outcome was utterly unknowable, leaving everyone to wonder what would happen next. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. To understand Michael's unsettling behavior, we need to go back, far from the polished courtroom and the judge's piercing gaze. His story really began in the sprawling, anonymous suburbs of a major U.S. city, a place where houses looked alike and lives often felt just as uniform. It was a middle-class neighborhood, quiet and manicured, but sometimes, beneath the surface, there was a strange detachment, a self-absorption that could be easy to miss. Kids grew up here with everything they needed, often more than they needed, and sometimes that was part of the problem. Michael's days followed a predictable, almost monotonous rhythm. School, which he navigated with minimal effort, just enough to get by. Afternoons were often lost to the glowing screens of video games, where virtual worlds offered endless distractions and easy victories. Evenings were a blur of social media, scrolling through curated feeds, chasing likes, and engaging in superficial interactions that rarely went deeper than a quick emoji or a sarcastic comment. There was a distinct lack of anything that truly engaged him, nothing that asked him to look beyond his own immediate desires or to connect with something meaningful. His world was largely self-contained, a digital bubble where consequences felt distant and real-world empathy was rarely required. His parents, like many in their neighborhood, were busy people. They worked hard, often long hours, striving to provide Michael with every material comfort they could imagine. A big house, the latest gadgets, a good car when he turned 16. These were their expressions of love and care. But in their pursuit of financial stability, they often became absent figures in other ways. Dinners were sometimes rushed, conversations were often quick recaps of the day, and deep emotional guidance was scarce. Not out of malice, but out of a shared belief that providing for him materially was enough. They blurred the lines of what was acceptable, often letting small infractions slide, assuming he would eventually grow out of it. This created an environment where boundaries were soft and expectations for personal responsibility were often implicit rather than clearly stated. Within this context, Michael's personality began to solidify. He developed a growing sense of entitlement, a quiet expectation that things should and would go his way. Minor frustrations would often be met with an eye roll or a dismissive attitude. He learned quickly that if he pushed just hard enough or ignored something long enough, the issue would often resolve itself, or someone else would step in to fix it. This pattern chipped away at any natural inclination he might have had towards considering the feelings of others. Consequences, in his world, were often things that happened to other people, or things that could be easily sidestepped. Early tensions were subtle at first. A few times, he was caught telling a white lie to get out of chores. Or he'd make a sarcastic comment that stung a friend, only to brush it off as a joke. There were instances where he'd break a small promise, then act confused when someone was upset. These weren't huge red flags on their own, but they were like tiny cracks appearing in a foundation. Each small act of defiance, each instance of pushing boundaries, slowly widened the disconnect between Michael and the concept of empathy. He was drifting further and further from understanding how his actions truly affected those around him, setting the stage for the much larger conflicts that would eventually bring him to that courtroom. The small cracks in Michael's character began to spread, becoming more noticeable, more unsettling. It wasn't just white lies or sarcastic remarks anymore. It was a consistent pattern of behavior that chipped away at any trust or goodwill people had for him. He developed a habit of making light of others' misfortunes, a twisted way of deflecting attention from his own shortcomings, or simply finding amusement in someone else's pain. A friend might share a story of a bad day, a failed test, or a minor injury, and Michael would respond with a dismissive laugh or a comment like, "Serves you right for not studying," or "That's what you get for being clumsy." These weren't isolated incidents, they were frequent, leaving a trail of hurt feelings and awkward silences in their wake. Broken promises became a regular feature of his interactions. He'd agree to help a classmate with a project, then conveniently forget when the deadline loomed. He'd tell his parents he'd clean his room, only for it to remain a chaotic mess for days. When confronted, he'd either feign ignorance, offer a flimsy excuse, or simply shrug, as if his word held no real weight. There was no real remorse, just a mild annoyance at being called out. He seemed to genuinely believe that his convenience outweighed any commitment he had made to others. This casual disregard for his word eroded the foundations of his relationships, turning friendships into transactional arrangements where only Michael's needs were consistently met. His behavior also started veering into more overtly abusive territory, often targeting those he perceived as weaker or less capable. Younger kids at school sometimes became the subject of his taunts, their insecurities exploited for his entertainment. He wouldn't directly physically harm them, but his words could be just as cutting, leaving them feeling small and humiliated. He'd hide their backpacks, trip them in the hallway, or spread rumors, all while maintaining an air of detached amusement. When teachers or other authority figures tried to intervene, Michael would adopt an innocent, wide-eyed look, denying everything or twisting the narrative to make himself seem like the victim. He was a master of plausible deniability, always finding a way to escape direct consequences. Neglecting responsibilities became another hallmark of his progressive erosion of moral conduct. Projects at school were turned in late, if at all. His part-time job, secured through his father's connections, was treated with similar apathy. He'd show up late, leave early, and do the bare minimum, often complaining about the effort required. This wasn't laziness. It was a deeper refusal to engage with the demands of the real world, a belief that rules and expectations applied to everyone else but him. His parents, still trying to understand him, would often step in to smooth things over, inadvertently reinforcing his belief that someone would always clean up his messes. The narrative built a clear picture of a young man who consistently prioritized his own fleeting desires over the well-being and feelings of others. Empathy was an abstract concept, accountability a foreign word. He lived in a world where his own comfort and amusement were the primary drivers, and anyone who got in the way was either ignored or subtly undermined. This pattern wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, though perhaps unconscious, choice to exist solely within his own self-serving bubble. By the time Michael found himself in that courtroom, laughing and mocking the grieving family, it was not an isolated outburst. It was the culmination of years of unchecked behavior, a lifetime of emotional detachment that had been allowed to fester and grow. The incident was simply the most public and stark manifestation of a character that had been progressively shaped by a lack of boundaries, a surplus of indulgence, and a profound absence of genuine human connection. The laughter in the courtroom wasn't just a sign of disrespect. It was the echo of a soul that had long since forgotten how to feel for anyone but itself. Tensions surrounding Michael's behavior only intensified, becoming almost unbearable for those around him. His parents, who had initially tried to rationalize his actions or cover for them, found themselves increasingly frustrated. The casual disrespect he showed in small ways, like leaving his clothes all over the house or ignoring requests, escalated into outright defiance when confronted about more serious issues. Arguments became a regular occurrence, often erupting without warning over seemingly minor things, but always stemming from his irresponsibility and lack of respect for their rules or feelings. He'd storm out of the house, slamming doors, leaving his parents to pick up the pieces of their broken conversations. They tried different approaches, strictness, reasoning, even pleading, but nothing seemed to stick. Michael had developed an almost impenetrable shield of indifference. He'd nod along, pretend to listen, and then do exactly what he wanted anyway. His mother would often be in tears, his father stewing in silent anger, both feeling helpless against the wall Michael had built around himself. Their home, once a place of relative peace, now felt like a minefield, every conversation a potential explosion. Family members, who had once admired their success and comfortable life, began to express quiet disapproval. Aunts and uncles would offer unsolicited advice, their voices hushed with concern, suggesting therapy or stricter discipline. Michael's grandparents, who had doted on him as a child, now viewed him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. Holiday gatherings became strained, with awkward silences whenever Michael's name came up. He felt the weight of their judgment, though he'd never admit it, often retreating to his room or burying his face in his phone to avoid their scrutinizing glances. Neighbors, who had observed his transformation from a bright, if somewhat arrogant, kid to a genuinely problematic young man, also began to view Michael with caution and judgment. Their casual greetings became shorter, their smiles less genuine. They'd pull their children inside when Michael was loitering outside, or politely decline when his parents suggested a neighborhood barbecue. The once friendly block began to feel colder, more distant, a reflection of the social pressure that was slowly building around Michael and his family. The whispers followed him, a constant low hum of disapproval that he pretended not to hear. Despite his outward indifference, Michael showed subtle signs of internal pressure. He'd become more irritable, snapping at friends for minor provocations, or retreating into long periods of silence. His phone, once a source of constant connection, became a tool for withdrawal, his face often illuminated by its glow late into the night. He slept more erratically, and his appetite fluctuated. He was still the same defiant Michael on the surface, but beneath it, the cracks were starting to form, though he never truly broke. He'd never allow himself to show weakness. The oppressive summer heat added to the suffocating psychological weight. The air hung thick and heavy, mirroring the tension that permeated Michael's life. The hushed whispers of concerned adults seemed to carry further in the still, hot air, reaching him even when he tried to tune them out. The sterile hum of suburban life, usually a comforting backdrop, now sounded like a constant, low-grade anxiety. Every manicured lawn, every perfectly painted house, felt like a judgment, a silent testament to the expectations he was failing to meet. The mounting pressure was almost palpable, a silent force pushing him closer and closer to a breaking point. The breaking point wasn't a sudden explosion, but the inevitable crash of a train that had been speeding off the rails for years. It was a late afternoon when Michael decided to pull what he thought would be the ultimate prank. He and two other friends, fueled by cheap energy drinks and a desperate need for attention, targeted the local community garden. This wasn't just any garden. It was a project spearheaded by Mrs. Henderson, a beloved retired teacher, and maintained by volunteers, many of whom were elderly or had disabilities. It was a place of pride, connection, and fresh produce for the neighborhood. Their plan was simple: uproot as many plants as possible, spray paint a few walls, and film it all for social media laughs. What they didn't account for was Mr. Petrov, a Vietnam veteran who spent most of his days tending his small plot in the garden, finding peace there. He had a heart condition, and the doctor had warned him against stress. Michael, in his rush to tear down a trellis, didn't see Mr. Petrov emerge from behind a row of corn. Mr. Petrov, startled by the noise and the sight of the destruction, clutched his chest and fell. The boys panicked. The laughter died in their throats. Michael, for the first time, felt a cold knot of fear. Not for himself, but for the still figure on the ground. They fled, leaving Mr. Petrov alone. He was found by another volunteer a few minutes later, barely conscious. The vandalism was bad enough, but the news of Mr. Petrov's heart attack, directly linked to the incident, sent shockwaves through the community. Michael and his friends were identified quickly, thanks to security cameras and their own foolish social media posts. When Judge Caprio spoke, his voice was calm, but every word landed like a stone. He had listened patiently to the police report, the distraught testimony of Mrs. Henderson, and the tearful account from Mr. Petrov's daughter. He had also listened to Michael's lawyer, who painted a picture of a misguided youth, a good kid who made a bad mistake. And then he had listened to Michael himself, who, even after all this, still managed to offer a half-hearted apology, more concerned with his own predicament than the harm he had caused. "Michael," Judge Caprio began, leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the young man, "you stand before this court not just for property damage, but for the pain you inflicted, the trust you broke, and the fear you caused. Mr. Petrov is recovering, but his life was put at risk because of your thoughtless actions." The judge paused, letting his words sink in. "The state requests a standard sentence: probation, community service, and restitution. But I believe that would be too easy for you." A murmur went through the courtroom. Michael, who had been expecting a slap on the wrist, looked up, a flicker of genuine surprise on his face. Judge Caprio continued, "My judgment is different. You will serve your community service, yes, but not just anywhere. You will spend every day for the next 6 months, from sunrise to sunset, at that very community garden. You will rebuild every trellis, replant every flower, and restore every vegetable patch you destroyed. You will report directly to Mrs. Henderson, and you will learn from her, not just about gardening, but about respect, hard work, and the value of community." He wasn't finished. "Furthermore, you will visit Mr. Petrov every single week, not just to apologize, but to sit with him, to listen to his stories, to understand the life you nearly took. And you will write a weekly report detailing what you learned, what you felt, and how your perspective changed. This report will be submitted directly to me. And if you miss a single day at the garden, or a single visit with Mr. Petrov, or fail to submit a single report, your probation will be revoked, and you will spend a year in juvenile detention. This is not about punishment, Michael. It is about understanding." The courtroom was silent. This wasn't the kind of sentence anyone expected. It was a verdict that dug deeper, aimed not just at the crime, but at the empty space where empathy should have been. It was a challenge, a forced confrontation with the real-world impact of his actions, designed to make Michael finally see beyond himself. The judge's words hung in the air, a heavy, undeniable truth. Michael's parents, who had sat through the proceedings with a mixture of hope and dread, now slumped in their seats, their faces a mask of public shame. They had expected a fine, maybe some community service, but not this. Not a daily, grinding confrontation with the consequences of their son's actions. Friends who had come to court, expecting a quick resolution, now looked away, some whispering, others simply staring at the floor. A few, however, perhaps seeing a flicker of hope in the judge's unconventional sentence, exchanged glances that spoke of a different kind of support, a quiet understanding that this might just be what Michael needed. The full weight of Judge Caprio's ruling settled on Michael like a physical burden. It wasn't a simple punishment. It was a challenging journey of forced empathy and responsibility. The first few days at the community garden were brutal. Mrs. Henderson, a woman hardened by years of tending to both plants and people, showed him no special treatment. She handed him a shovel and pointed to a section of overgrown weeds, her eyes as sharp as ever. "Start here, Michael, and don't stop until it's done right." He worked under the scorching sun, his hands blistering, his muscles aching in ways he hadn't known possible. Every broken trellis he repaired, every patch of soil he tilled, every seedling he planted, served as a stark reminder of the senseless destruction he had caused. He learned about the delicate balance of an ecosystem, the patience required for growth, and the sheer effort it took to nurture something back to life. His weekly visits to Mr. Petrov were even harder. The old man, frail but with a spirit that refused to be broken, would sit in his armchair, sometimes silent, sometimes sharing stories of his life, his family, and the joy the garden brought him. Michael, initially uncomfortable and eager for the visits to end, found himself listening. He heard about Mr. Petrov's wife, who had passed away years ago, and how the garden had become his solace, a living memorial to their shared love for nature. He learned about the pride Mr. Petrov took in donating fresh produce to the local food bank, and the camaraderie he shared with the other volunteers. With each visit, the abstract concept of victim slowly transformed into a real person, a man with a rich history and a gentle soul, whose life Michael had carelessly disrupted. The weekly reports, initially filled with superficial observations, gradually began to reflect a deeper engagement, a hesitant acknowledgement of his own blindness. Mrs. Henderson, observing Michael from a distance, saw the change, slow and grudging at first, but undeniably there. The smirk was gone, replaced by a focused frown as he concentrated on his tasks. The dismissive shrugs gave way to a weary nod of understanding. He still complained sometimes, but the complaints were about the heat or the stubborn roots, not about the injustice of his situation. The garden, once a scene of his thoughtless destruction, was becoming his classroom, teaching him humility and connection. The true victory was not just Michael's budding remorse, but the quiet peace that settled over Mrs. Henderson and, eventually, Mr. Petrov's family. They saw their suffering acknowledged, not through vengeance, but through a challenging path to potential change. There was no grand apology, no sudden, dramatic transformation. Instead, it was a slow, arduous process of rebuilding both the garden and, perhaps, a young man's soul. The boy who had laughed in court, who had dismissed the pain of others, was now learning the quiet dignity of labor, the profound value of community, and the true cost of his own indifference. The narrative concluded with a powerful, intimate reflection on the nature of empathy, accountability, and the long road to true understanding. It connected Michael's past entitlement to his present challenging reality, and hinted at a future where genuine remorse might begin to take root, leaving the viewer in thoughtful silence.